Hi friends, Max Elage here. On this episode of the Corpus Animus podcast, I have my friend and fellow TTT coach Kyle Ruth on to talk about masters athletes. So if you're an old ass athlete or somebody that's gonna become an old ass athlete, listen up. We have some resources for masters athletes. If you're interested in those, head over to trainingthinktank.com/masters.
Yep, that's it. We'll see you there.
If you're on the go and you want to listen to just the audio version, subscribe to the Corpus Animus podcast on your favorite podcast app. Learn more about the art and science of program design for CrossFit in our online educational platform, The Classroom. Get a free 7-day trial at trainingthinktank.com/classroom trial. Do you win more now as a masters athlete than you did as a regular athlete?
So as a masters athlete, I use the context of like,
oh my God.
I heard that on the microphone.
That fart got picked up 4 feet away from the microphone.
Wow.
That's going to smell.
Yeah,
that was real?
Yeah. If that gets
I'm so used to you doing the mouth farts,
yeah,
Chris.
if that gets bad, then
If I ever mouth fart that good.
pause this.
No, I just used the recent PR thing.
He's just
You know what
good.
I mean? So I get victories.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like this is a masters PR.
Yeah, or this is like a current PR. This is the heaviest I've lifted in the last 5 years.
Is anyone going to take this podcast seriously now that it started with?
No.
Oh, no,
Chris's
we're not going
butthole
to use
ripping
that.
open?
We're not going to use that one. Dude,
No.
that was,
Can you taste it?
no,
can't.
thankfully it's
I
not
can.
over here.
I'm gonna-
There's a little ventilation thing right there. So we're
Smell
good.
the coffee and get the fart out of my nose.
All right. What are we talking about today?
We're talking about masters athletes. You are a masters athlete.
You
I'll
are
be
soon
a
to be.
masters athlete this year. I used to feel really uncomfortable talking about masters athletes when I was coaching. Like 10 years ago, I was 25, and I'd be working with people who are like 40, telling them principles of training masters athletes based on what I've observed and training people. And I just felt really weird about it.
Does it feel more authentic now talking about it now that you are aging into the 35 to 39? Or do you kind of like me feel like all the masters that are in like the 40 and beyond division look down at us and it's like, you're not really a masters athlete?
Well, I do notice that I used to really get upset if I was coaching a masters athlete and they wouldn't just accept that, like, hey, there's a natural aging process. Like, yes, you can beat it.
What did you used to call it? Decay?
I call it decay. Your body's decaying as you get older. We
no.
did a video where I said that like 5 times and Mike was like, stop calling it that. Masters are never going to work with us. I'm like, what happens to us? We decay and go back into the ground.
To be clear, Myra Brandt, one of the masters 40 to 44 athletes that I work with, she calls us baby masters. So
Okay.
that gives you a perspective.
All right, fine. I'm a baby's masters, but what I used to hate that they wouldn't accept that.
That sounds
Or
bad.
You say,
Baby master? No, Myra, no.
yeah, no. And you'd be like, hey, you might need to lower your volume or do a little bit more skill work. And they'd be like, no, this is what the 20-year-olds are doing. Now I feel that resistance. I'm like, I'm not accepting that I'm older. I'm like 35 is not that old. Fuck that.
Yeah,
But I also recognize that the stuff I was saying earlier was still right. It's just now I'm more empathetic when people fight back to it. I'm like, all right, fine. You want to try? Go ahead.
Now you just say it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I think there's a number of different problems that you run into either coaching masters athletes or I've experienced now as
Personally,
a very fresh masters athlete. It was my first season in, but I think some of them are dealing with some of the recovery problems that are associated with aging. Just the fact, like you can say whatever you want. I feel like my recovery is great, but if I compare it to when I was 26 or 27 or even, 30, at the highlight of my mediocre CrossFit career, I just don't recover as fast. If I get a muscle strain, I'm still dealing with the hip strain that I had before the Masters Fitness Champs. That was in July.
And also your lifestyle to support recovery is way better now. You have a sauna in your house. You control your whole life schedule. You sleep enough, like all this stuff you'd think would add to recovery. But even with all that stuff being more dialed in than when you're in your 20s, you just can't get around the better hormones, less responsibility, like all that stuff just plays a big role in recovery.
Do you think people sneaks up on them? Like when you gain weight, if it's you and you're looking at yourself every day, it kind of sneaks up on you. You think the recovery is the same, the lack of the ability to recover?
Yeah.
You just don't notice that it's going away.
It's really one of those things that it creeps, like you put it creeps up on you to the point that Like you don't even know that you don't recover as well until you get a tweak.
Yeah, that's what I think it is. I don't think you originally start to notice that you're not recovering from the intense bouts of exercise. You're like, oh, I can't do a max effort 1K row at 9 and then a 1RM at 12 because I'm impacted from the 1K row until 4 days later. I'm like, oh, now I feel better.
Well, as a younger masters athlete, and with some of the younger, I want to say like 40 to 44 masters athletes that I've worked with, they can come here to the TTT training camps and they can hang for the whole weekend. And it's not that you're seeing their lack of recovery throughout the course of, a 3-day training block. It's just how long it takes them to bounce back from that and get back to, the point where they can really attack their training again. It's like, I compete on a team with Luke Parker, who's, 26, maybe 27 now. And he bounces back. He literally came back the day after we competed in a team event where we didn't get back here until like 1 a.m. The next day he was in here testing multiple events for his next comp and I took 4 days off.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it creeps up on you, but if you're doing intense stuff, if you're doing competitions or if you get tweaked, then you realize it pretty quickly. You're like, oh man, why is this lingering for so long? Or you get an issue that just doesn't go away. And I think a lot of people, they start to think like, oh, well, it's just squatting that makes my knee sore. I'll just stop doing CrossFit and my knee will feel better. And you don't realize like, oh, well, you just have like, some arthritic deterioration and some joints that have been overused on some bad movement patterns that you've done thousands and thousands and thousands of reps on over the course of your life. Your knee might never feel the same again. And that's like a shitty thing for people to hear. Maybe like sounds like it's a hopeless situation, but like some degree of joint pain or body not feeling perfect is probably just part of the normal human experience.
The nice thing as a competitor, as a masters competitor, is that you do know that the people that you're competing with are in the same boat as you. So that's one of the challenges with comparing yourself to some of the younger athletes, right? Because they just don't have the same degree of wear and tear on their bodies that you do. And so when you're like, if I'm trying to compare my recovery to Luke Parker, it's terrible. But if I compare my recovery ability with the recovery habits that I implement compared to other 35 to 39-year-old masters, I probably recover really, really well, relatively speaking.
It's all relative.
Yeah, I think that's an important psychological shift for masters athletes, especially those of us that are just aging into it, or, people that are in their 40s that want to run with the 25-year-olds. Like, just make the psychological shift, compare yourself to a different group of people, still go out and train with some of those younger athletes. Just don't do the same amount of volume that they're doing so that you can recover from it.
Yeah. So that's problem number one. I'd say problem number two is maybe not necessarily a problem, just an observation, is that the individual variation in terms of how you would train masters athletes is so different if somebody's just getting into the sport as a masters athlete versus if somebody has been in the sport, like you have competed in the sport for 10 years and now transitioned into a masters. You already have put the hours on developing all the skills and know all the skills and have practiced racing. Whereas if you're late to start as a masters athlete, that can be pretty tough because you're trying to learn so many different things and you're going to be hampered by your ability to do a lot of the intense work. A lot of the competitions are going to be hard to get to or hard to tolerate a lot of them in a year. So I think prioritization of skill work, lower intensity stuff, maybe more of the mental and cerebral side of just being an athlete comes into play a lot more if you're getting into the sport at 35 and just love it and have found progress.
Or getting in at 50 or 55.
Yeah, for sure. So that can play a big role because in order to learn a skill, you got to do it a lot. But how do you do a lot of box jumps, for example, to figure out your rhythm and your timing and how to breathe doing them when your joints are maybe a little bit creaky and, doing rebounding puts gives you some jumper's knee or you risk your Achilles. Like it becomes a very, very delicate balance. Whereas if you're 20 years old, it's like, all right, well, 1 or 2 days a week, you can probably do 100 to 200 rebounding box jumps in Metcons or intervals to develop that skill.
Or even at 20 years old, you might be able to use like a grease the groove strategy, come in and do 25 or 30 box jumps,
every day.
In that instance, every single day that you train and just go in and you're plenty resilient to deal with that. I think that, speaks to one of the challenges that we have in the sport of CrossFit, in that there's so many different skills that an athlete has to develop that the reality is that volume itself just has to be higher.
Yeah.
And that's why it's easier to get into the sport when you're 18, 19, 20 than it is to get into the sport at 40, 50, or 55 or 60. right? Because there's just so much different stuff to work on. And you may have the time available as a master's athlete, but your body doesn't necessarily have the resilience available in order to actually recover from the volume that you need to learn all those skills. And the reality is that volume, it probably is one of the most effective tools for skill development. Like, yes, I personally think that like video review and like a more mindful approach to technical changes is really important. But once you've made those technical changes and locked them in, if you want them to be fatigue resistant, like if you want your muscle up technique to be consistent when you're at 179 beats per minute, it turns out that you have to spend time doing a lot of muscle ups and repetition. And if you're, 55 and each muscle up is, pretty much a 1RM, it's hard to accumulate the number of reps that are required in order to catch up to someone who started 10 years ago and was able to spend that time when their body was a little more resilient. So it's definitely a huge challenge, but not one that can't be overcome with smart training tools.
Well, I think also the fact that it's hard shouldn't necessarily be a deterrent, because there's so many things that I think of value that come from that. And also, as a sport itself, like let's say you dedicated yourself to triathlon, just weightlifting, or CrossFit, just to keep it kind of simple. I think, obviously every choice you make and every training decision you make has its cost or its consequence. However, if you're doing all weightlifting, for example, like your bone density will be pretty good. Maybe your hormonal function will be okay because you're, stressing it out under load and giving, testosterone signaling and all of that stuff. But potentially cardiac function, aerobic capacity, all those types of things might not necessarily get trained and might give you some specific risks. You do something like triathlon and say you're only doing those two things, and, you could potentially start to lower your bone density from the amount of volume, overstress your system. You're not developing tendon strength and all of the stuff in deeper end ranges. Your movements start to become a little bit more linear. So CrossFit as a sport, if you're saying for a master's athlete, and it's not necessarily about glory and money, could potentially be a good, beneficial lifestyle tool to keep you healthy, resilient, strong, well-rounded as a physical entity through your older years. So I think the fact that it's hard might not necessarily be a deterrent. It might just be, look, you got to do things smarter, right? You see the older athletes, even in our sport, they seem to be okay when it's like open format. Like you got to go one workout, max effort, over a 3-day period, maybe do it twice, and they stay at the top for a while. But then you see them in a competition and it's like, all right, do that as your first workout, then do it again in 3 hours and then another 3 hours. And you start to see like, they just can't keep up that level of sustained intensity.
Something that I picked up when I was watching some of the other age divisions at the Masters Fitness Collective Championships a couple months ago was
the one that you won.
Yeah, I was just going to say, woo, Karu. I did it twice.
Thanks for clapping.
Where'd you spend all your prize money?
Actually traveling to Pensacola to go compete in another event.
No.
There you go.
That's what I wanted.
But we took third. We did well. No. So one of the things that I observed is that the athletes that moved well, and when I say moved well, had like requisite mobility to get into good positions, had good efficiency in their movement patterns. Those athletes lasted really well throughout the entire weekend. And the ones who came out hot and just, like they muscled their snatches and they overdid each of their cleans, and like each of their muscle ups was like, it looked like they were trying to do a max effort muscle up. Like they got really beat down by the end of the weekend. So I think one of the things that's important for a master's athlete, regardless of whether you're someone who's been in the sport for 10 years or if you just started, is start with good movement quality, address your mobility limitations, make sure that your movements are absolutely as efficient as possible so that you're getting as little wear and tear and expending as little energy for each event as possible.
Yeah. One good proxy for that, I think, for masters athletes is the speed with which you can do each rep smoothly to full range. Cause you start to see masters athletes getting tight and creaky and they'll like not be able to squat fast because their balance will be getting off, or the end range is so weak in the bottom position that they'll start to lose stability forward and backwards and have to step to save themselves if they're, losing balance when they're doing thrusters, for example. So as a training tool, which I think can kind of lead into the third problem, is that you have to have for yourself as a master's athlete some sort of intelligent measurement of progress. We were talking earlier in the podcast, like we may never hit strength PRs again.
I
Right?
doubt that I will ever clean 365 again.
Yeah. Like I challenged Kyle on it and I was like, well, I think I might be able to PR a deadlift. You see power lifters into their 40s. A lot of them are on synthetics. So maybe that's part of why they do it, but slow strength seems to be something that you could develop for a really long time. You don't really see many weightlifters in the like mid 30s, early 40s, even just recreationally, like the speed and velocity of those things, the depth of positions you need to hit generally is not something that most older athletes will do. So the idea of snatching over 310 in my lifetime, while I'm also doing burpees and box jumps and running and trying to get all the CrossFit skills better, like the likelihood's pretty low. So you gotta, if you want to compete in the sport, you gotta have an intelligent metric of progress for yourself. It might be like movement quality or movement speed, or I want to get this better. This is how I'm measuring it. Can't be about, PRs and screaming happiness in the gym.
I think one of the things that I've done personally to deal with this is rather than looking at my lifetime PRs, I look at like recent. So I give myself like basically a 2 to 3 year window. And it's like, is this the heaviest that I've hit in the last 2 to 3 years? So for example, like a 265 snatch would be a 5 pound recent PR in the last 2 or 3 years, which is 25 pounds under my lifetime 1RM.
Yeah.
But it's something that I can look at and say like at this current stage of my fitness, this would be a PR. But the other thing that I've just personally noticed is that my engine has been able to improve dramatically as I've gotten older. It's almost like as my strength capacity reached its ceiling, my endurance capacity was just starting to build.
That's pretty common, I think, in athletes, like even in triathlon and research studies. I think people can develop their ability for like up until their 40s or 50s that they can improve their, I don't know what metric, maybe VO2 or some sort of
lactate threshold.
Yeah,
one of the measurables.
Yeah, one of the measurables they can improve for a really long period of time. Whereas it's pretty commonly talked about that you're losing speed and power production after, I think 28 is the normal like research point where they say like that's your anabolic peak for men, and it can be like up to 35 for females.
Yeah, and I think to think that your peak at 28 means that you can't continue to get stronger after 28 is probably, I think that's dependent on your training age, how consistent you were before that point. So, if you're a 28-year-old male, don't think that you're like, oh man, all my progress is done. A lot of that is based on people who had been training in the sport that they were competing in since the time that they were like 12 years old. Their training age is probably double what yours is right now.
Those are just statistical averages. People could, and if you get into the sport as a master's athlete and you just started, you could probably get stronger until you're 50. Yeah. So those are just, with all research, take it with a grain of salt, but just as a proxy for people.
I think so. You were kind of touching on like having a benchmark for yourself. And I think for masters athletes, especially in the older divisions, I think a full range of motion, really solid overhead squat is probably the thing that is the most challenging for most masters. When you think, if I just think back to, some of the masters athletes that I watched, the people at MFC, like
snatching is a huge issue.
Yes. Being able to lock out that bar overhead and reach full depth. I think that's like, if you can do that, you're probably in a position in the sport that you're going to have a lot of the requisite mobility that's required to be successful in the sport. Yeah. I'm not saying that just training an overhead squat is going to make you a successful masters athlete, but you could use that as a benchmark.
Yeah. That's one of a benchmark just for your movement quality.
Right.
But I think there's a reason, and a very good reason, why the overhead squat is used as an assessment tool in so many movement disciplines. Like it's one of the FMS screens. I think there's a good reason for that.
Ankles, knees, hips, shoulders, thoracic spine, all of it's all captured in there.
Yeah. Are there any other big movements that masters struggle with? Obviously gymnastics is the kipping stuff.
A lot of that depends on their background, right? Yeah. So if you have someone who had a gymnastics background, a lot of times they're really successful with those things. Yeah. So I think some of it's, background dependent. But I do agree. I think some of the complex ring muscle ups, bar muscle ups, even handstand walking, all those things tend to be bigger challenge movements for masters athletes, just as a result of, years of not moving through those ranges of motion. And then all of a sudden you're trying to move your shoulder through massive in-range flexion and extension. And it's a big challenge.
So something that one of my physical coach mentors has told me in the past was at some point when you're writing master's programs, what you're trying to do is slow the deterioration of performance output as much as possible, because it's going down. It's going down, but a successful training program would keep it flat for as long as possible, or would take it from like, all right, you're losing 10% fitness every year to you're losing 2% fitness every year.
You're trying to affect the rate of change, essentially.
Yeah. So I've been trying to figure out, I have notes on it. I don't have any sort of formal system. And I think part of that procrastination is that I don't want to do it, but I've been trying to figure out what's a data set of fitness tests that don't have a super high requisite level of mobility needs or skill that you could test year after year after year without too much, like maybe you put it over the course of a weekend or something like this, that has a bunch of different fitness characteristics, and you collect that data over time. And then try, okay, once you start to know, like, well, I'm deteriorating, like I can't PR my 2K row anymore, it's not going to happen. Then you go out and you fight to keep your numbers from like as close as you can to the average, and you can create a progress curve on your rate of deterioration.
It's so funny. If you said, Kyle, go out and PR your 2K row, I'd be like, yeah, I can go do that right now.
Yeah.
If you were like, Kyle, go out and PR your deadlift, I'd be like, I'd be 100 pounds under my 1RM.
Yeah. But at 50, you think you could PR your 2K row?
Not
at some point it's going to happen.
Not a chance. My guess is that that's going to happen in the next 5 years, is I'm going to get to the point where that curve is going to start deteriorating. But I do agree with you. I think as demoralizing as this may be for athletes that are, aging into masters or getting deeper into the masters, like the reality is your primary goal is to like beat the aging curve or beat that deterioration curve as effectively as possible. But I still will hold that I think one of the most effective strategies for that is really good movement quality and just having almost an obsession for movement efficiency.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. I think it's important. So that's 3. Number 4 would be that your life priorities are different. And I think that this kind of ties into what you were saying. A young athlete can feel depressed hearing these conversations. Or I know when I was younger and I heard them, like, I'm not going to be like
scary,
that.
Wasn't it?
Yeah. Like, oh, it's not going to happen to me. And sometimes masters athletes who still have massive egos about performance will still struggle with that. And I've seen a lot of them that just won't put themselves in the arena anymore. They'll be there and they just won't do Metcons, or they'll watch.
Know plenty of those people.
Yeah. And they'll
names.
talk.
We need names.
We're not calling people out. Yeah. And people will, talk about their glory days and what they used to be able to do and not actually put themselves in there. But I think one of the things that you need to do as a masters athlete is, it could be about winning, right? Like you could say, all right, I want to go and I want to win the 35 to 39. But most people, like, you have kids, you have a job, you have other responsibilities, you have some sort of purpose in your life. The competition at that point is about enriching your experience and going there and finding your best self and getting out of your comfort zone so that you can grow as a human. I think all those same things are true for younger athletes. And I think if I were to take over a group of like 18-year-olds, I would try to, in my head, I would have just as much as I would have a performance and competition style progress. I'd think, how can I progress these people as humans?
Yeah.
So that way, when they're done with sport, they're not just unidimensional things that can only do thrusters and pull-ups and shit like that.
I think as a younger athlete, some of the things that tend to motivate people are like proving other people wrong, proving their own worth through physical dominance and things like that. But as an older athlete, at least in my own experience and with the masters that I've worked with, it's like setting an example for your children or for the next generation.
Yeah.
Or, constantly seeking challenge, because, a life without challenge is really just a slow death. Like those things are the things that drive. I probably stole that from somebody.
Say that one more time. I like that.
You really want me to say that again?
And say it in a smooth voice, like a Barry White voice. Sing it.
Ceasing to seek challenge is a slow death. Ooh. Yeah. Yeah, you made me lose my train of thought, Max.
I fucked that whole
Damn
thing
it.
up. My bad.
No, so anyway, I think the motivations and purposes change as you get older. I think it was very clear to me when I was younger. I just wanted to dominate everybody, prove everybody wrong, show that I was
get over
your
insecurity, build the biggest ego, just all of it.
Yeah, now I just want to set a really damn good example for my children, inspire the athletes that I coach, be a good representation for the Training Think Tank brand, like that. Those are the things that I want to do as an athlete now. Yeah. And it feels much less self-centered, and I can connect with it a little bit better as an athlete than I did when I was younger. I just wanted to dominate everybody.
Yeah. And I think by doing that, it allows, so I didn't have fun as an athlete when I was young.
I don't think I did either.
And I still think in some capacity, I'm a little bit more of like a grinder or a workhorse. Like a lot of times I'm doing the work out of habit because I made a commitment to myself that I was going to do the work. But in my head, I'm like, sometimes, not all the time. And I'm not saying that you should do this. I'll be like, fuck this. I don't want to be doing this at all right now. Like, this is so shitty and stupid. And I joke around with my training partners. Like, I've quit CrossFit 85 times in the last year because of the discomfort or not being, suited for it, or putting an hour a week in a fucking burpee speed and then doing a burpee Metcon and still getting my ass kicked. Like, that shit is just frustrating sometimes. Yeah. But in spite of that, I still have so much more fun now than I used to have as a kid. And I think a lot of that was understanding a priority structure in terms of like what's really important to me in my life. And I feel like maturity or age or the wisdom that you get with just living a bunch of years is the only thing that can give that to you. As a younger athlete, somebody can tell you that, but you haven't lived it yet. So I feel like as a younger athlete, you're better off just being like, you want to fucking win? Good. Go do it. Do everything that you possibly can and center your whole life around it, because that quest will teach you. It'll give you your experience. It'll teach you if you're suited for that. It'll teach you if you're not. It'll introduce you to people. If you get good enough, you'll get doors that open up to communities. And if you're not, you'll know. You're like, well, that's not who you're supposed to be.
And at some point, you'll have to move on.
Yeah. But if you do that at 35 or 40, especially if you have like kids and a family and a job or a business or whatever it is that's priority to you, I think it will just consume you to the point that it makes you shitty at all the other stuff that should be more important to you than your, the amount of thrusters you did in a 10-minute AMRAP.
And watching your life deteriorate around you will probably make you a shitty athlete on top of it, because you'll be so stressed about that all the time. It's like a self-reinforcing negative spiral. So is our recommendation here that older athletes subdue their ego as much as possible, or that maybe we've just witnessed that older athletes that are successful tend to have more subdued egos as a result of painful losses younger in life?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I mean, I think the takeaway that I would have is like on the company seal, there's like Corpus Animus, and it's this concept that I have of the not even that I have, but that I took from earlier cultures, that there's a unification of mind and body. And I think it's very important as you get older to put a little bit more time into the mind and the mental, because the body's not the same as it used to be. So even one of your competitive performance advantages is going through workouts with better strategies, with better pacing, better warm-ups, better food and fueling, better recovery. And all of that stuff is done in the cerebral. So if you set your life priorities in a way and you reflect, and this is what I want to do, and this is what I want to contribute, you can ease pre-competition anxiety, and you can do so many things that I think just set you up for success as a masters athlete. So I'd say that the scales kind of just tip more towards you being more reflective and more thoughtful. It's not even that you can't have a big ego.
No, you probably could have a big ego, but you need to be more wise. You need to be more, think through your strategies, because the reality is at some point your physical capabilities are going to be matched to the people that you're competing against. Yeah. And then it comes down to good planning, developing a willpower. And I think part of developing willpower itself is like cultivating that outside of training, not just getting yourself to suffer in training, but learning how to sit better with suffering. Yeah. I found as a masters athlete now that spending more time meditating I feel like has been one of the things that's actually helped me be a better masters athlete. And I recommend that to all my own clients. And I think the older you are, probably the more time you should spend with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in most like sports psychology courses or one-on-ones, people will talk about that. Visualize your workouts, do some sort of relaxation, breathing, progressive muscular relaxation. All of those are meditative tools in some capacity. Very important for a high level performer, but I'd say even more important for somebody that's just moving into their, what would you call it? Are we middle-aged?
I don't know. I don't want to call it that, but if the average lifespan is 70, this is the 35, we're middle-aged, dude.
Yeah. So when you move into middle age, I think that's becomes more important and more necessary. You can't I just think about the the mind state I had, little things like I'd be in here even 5 years ago talking shit to Travis, and he'd be like, you know, he'd hit a lift and he'd talk shit about it. And I'd be like, I'll do that cold with no warm up. And I walked outside. I don't remember when it was, but I remember snatching 245. I tried to power snatch it and I didn't power snatch it, but no warm up, completely cold. I'd just been sitting and doing consults. I wouldn't,
Humble brag.
humble brag, my bad. But I would never even think to do that now. Like, it's just not even that I definitely can't do that now.
Well, you weren't thinking to do it then either.
Yeah. But I just, the lack of thought and just the instinctual nature is something that you might be able to get away with when you're young. But I think even those stupid decisions that I made back then had consequences, right? Like, how many times did I have to work on my back and my ankles and my knee? Like, my obsession with movement came from a stupid lack of thought approach to life.
Came from a really poor back squat.
Yeah. Damn you.
That was my fault.
Yeah. All right. So life priorities. I think the last one is just financial with regards to this sport. So, I mean, I know there's more expensive hobbies like golf, for example, $1,000 clubs and country clubs and
triathlon.
Yeah. Like
the bike itself.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not like CrossFit is out of this world expensive, but if you're talking about a gym membership, some sort of individual coaching resources, whether that's personal training at your gym, remote video review, a remote coach that helps you travel to competitions, jump ropes, backup jump ropes, different types of shoes for all the types of
creatine,
workouts. Yeah, supplements, all of that stuff.
Fish oil.
Yeah.
Since we're talking about masters athletes.
Yeah.
Do that.
So a young athlete, especially in today's culture, probably has a decent following on Instagram, probably has a body that people want to look at all the time. A lot of times they get that shit for free, or they get it for discounted, or they have some sort of way to earn it back, maybe even with prize money at competitions. For masters athletes, that's not really there. So you got to just accept that you're doing it as part of a hobby that's not it's not for
never
money.
Going to be a living for you.
Yeah. So it's probably something that people just have to make peace with. Again, maybe the life priority thing, like budget it out, make sure it's good with your partner, do all of that stuff ahead of time, because the longevity or the lack of longevity will often come because of the obstacles. So if you're having fights about spending money or time away from doing something else that somebody thinks that you need to be doing, and that's something that's in your ear month after month after month, it probably will be the thing that takes you out of it.
For sure.
So
literally listening to someone nag about your training constantly will ensure that your training is terrible, because that's what you'll be thinking about the entire time that you're training.
Yeah. And you'll be rushing.
Coached athletes that are dealing with that. Yeah. And man, their training quality is shit.
Yeah. Or the common one is like, I got to get it in and get it done. Right? Like, oh, I'm here to get it in. I'm like, that's not, if you really want to optimize yourself, you got to be there. Like, I'm here to get this.
That's good dating advice.
You gotta be in it to get better. And yeah, you got to complete it and get it in, but it's all about the quality of that.
To be clear, there are definitely going to be times, regardless of who you are, what your priorities are, what age you are, that you're going to just have to go into the gym and get it done. And like that's,
and it won't be perfect.
Yeah. That, I don't want to say that like your training session is automatically a loss if you don't do that. I mean, there are days as a masters athlete where I just go out and go for a run, because it's like, I look at my training and I look at the amount of work that I've got, and I know that I'm going to have to help my daughter study for a social studies test the next day. And like, I've got real obligations, and my hobby is going to have to take a back seat. So that means I strap on my running shoes and then go out the door and go run for 30 minutes. And that's what I get for the day.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think it's important for athletes who do have other priorities. And this is just kind of a generalized statement, not just masters athletes, but they need to be okay with the fact that sometimes training has to take a backseat, and that your world hasn't deteriorated. Like, you haven't lost everything because you went for a run instead of doing your assault bike thruster intervals.
Yeah, for sure. But I agree with that 100%. I think it's just something that people need to understand lies on a spectrum. If you're like what you're talking about all the time, and you're just always rushing through the work and making compromises, you probably never get better. And if you're doing the opposite and you're always prioritizing training and not the outside life stuff, then the outside life stuff will probably eventually get in the way of the training and make you not want to do it. So
you can't afford to go compete now because you've neglected that aspect.
Exactly. So I think it's just more balancing.
Y'all have both worked with handfuls, if not lots of masters athletes. Is there one common characteristic that the people who are successful share in common? Like, is there like that go-to, like, man, all the people that really made progress?
I would say discipline. It'd be the number one thing. So discipline around food behaviors, around warm-ups, around recovery if something goes bad. If their shoulders are nagging, they're not just like stubbornly pushing through it, but instead they're going and having the discipline to talk to me about changing their program and go and get massages. And
do you feel like they're just disciplined people to begin with, or they kind of learn that through trial and error?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. It could be that the most successful masters athletes were the most successful younger athletes whose discipline brought them to that point in the first place. Or it's just that you have to have that level of discipline as a masters athlete because you're just like, the risks are so much higher. You can get hurt much more frequently. You have less time to dedicate to it. So I think discipline, time management, organization, commitment, life priorities, like all that stuff, they just seem to be more, this is going to sound fucked up.
Hell yeah.
More whole humans. I've seen a lot of successful young athletes.
Oh, half human looking at.
Who are half human. Who I just talked to and I'm like, you are athlete. It's the only
identity that they have.
And there's nothing else. There's no other hobbies. There's no books you read. There's no one you talk to about anything other than thrusters, pull-ups, double unders, burpees, what's going on in the CrossFit space. Whereas I've never seen a masters athlete like that.
Yeah,
personally.
I've coached a number of masters games athletes at this point. And the one thing I would say is they're all very disciplined, but they're also not obsessed.
Yeah.
They're not obsessive about their training. They're not obsessive about their progress. They're not obsessive about their performance. They just they are disciplined and focused on the work that they need to put in and not trying to be like, well, I'm not progressing fast enough. They just focus on doing the work every damn day. And over time, that's the thing that leads them to be a masters games athlete.
Yeah. So we covered 5 of the common issues: recovery, people that have different starting points, how to measure progress, life priorities, and then the financial burden of doing it. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you would say, like if you had to give people like cues, how do you deal with this?
Well,
what's the best way to get around that stuff?
Before we get there, I do think there's one more challenge, and that's the fact that the masters
bonus. You didn't tell me to write that down.
Yeah, well, I just thought of it. It's the fact that up to this point, up to now, CrossFit HQ has basically just overlooked the masters division as like a secondhand thing. It's like I said, I've coached a lot of athletes at the CrossFit Games. They're stuck in like a chicken barn. I mean,
I don't think it's just HQ; it's the community.
Yeah,
in general.
You would say that, but then I go to a masters only event, and the community is like invested in it. Morning Chalk Up shows up. Like it's just
now.
a very now.
Yeah,
and I think the reality is that for this sport to have a way forward, as the number of masters athletes grows, because the sport becomes older and older and older, that ignoring or looking at that as a sideshow is going to be an issue for, it's going to create a challenge for the sport, not necessarily just for the athletes themselves.
Yeah. Sorry, I cut you off in the middle of that thought, but I just listened to a podcast this morning. I listened to 2, Dave Castro on Savans and Dave Castro on Talking Elite Fitness. So I don't remember which one it was from, but they talked about the masters competition being a bigger, more invested in thing. One of the things is for sure there's going to be more people than 10 as just a starting point. So I don't know what that looks like, but I think if anybody's in the business of making the games a business, which is what the CrossFit Games is, if people didn't know that, they make a profit or try to make a profit running that event and as a marketing thing for their brand. In order to do that, I would say that the investment in masters athletes has to be there, because masters athletes are generally going to have an income to be able to support that goal and have families that they'd want to bring out to watch them do it. Whereas a 20-year-old, what type of income are they going to have to support this in mass?
Yeah, but
generally,
who's
only going to
watching?
be the pros.
It's who's watching.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
Like, you got your family and your friends, but people want to watch the young guys.
Yeah.
Of course
I
they
mean,
do, but
people
also
want to
if you-
watch the highest performers. I want to watch
Yeah,
the
there you go.
highest
That's the better way to say
performers.
it.
If you think about it, the biggest fans of the younger athletes are the masters athletes.
Yeah.
So you can't alienate them, or else you alienate your biggest pool of raving fans.
Yeah.
So there's,
But my
there's a
point is
double-edged
they're probably
sword there.
watching not that.
Yeah,
sure.
like they're not watching the
I bet you if
Masters,
you look
yeah.
at the statistics on their YouTube accounts of the Masters, they're not watching that shit. Some of them are. I'm not saying people
Yeah.
don't, but they're watching the other stuff way more. So
For sure.
look at yourself, master athlete.
Yeah.
You're the problem.
Yeah, it is
Vote with your money.
it is a tough thing, I think, to try to figure out how to make it something that's highlighted. But I think it's not necessarily about the media highlighting it. It's more about making
the community highlighted.
Yeah, making it a spectacle in the events, making them feel like they're important. All of that stuff is more important than it actually being like, hey, we're going to televise the 40 to 45-year-old Amanda that's 5 minutes slower than the guys that are 20 that are doing it with 100 more pounds in 2 minutes faster.
I've said it before. They don't televise the Masters Olympics.
Yeah.
Right. Like you're not going to see that, but there is support for those things, right?
Yeah.
Those things exist. And they don't, I think when the people are competing in them, they don't feel like they're in a chicken barn.
Yeah.
Just to
so,
be clear.
so you ruined our list of
I know.
5
I
things
added
to
a
add a
sixth.
6th. But now back to my question, any tips, overall concluding thoughts? If you were talk to 2 Masters people, one is somebody that's just getting started and they're a Masters athlete, and somebody who's maybe like in their mid 30s, starting to transition out of the elite. Maybe they were trying to make sanctionals before, and now they realize like, I'm probably not going to make it, but I got 2 years to Masters. What type of advice would you have to get over these obstacles? or
Really
through them?
specific second person.
Yeah.
No, so your first
Yeah,
person who
that's-
just got into the sport. I know it's you
Yeah.
for sure. The first person who just got into the sport, I think number one, determine what your aspirations are. If you want to actually like climb the ranks of the Masters, then go hire a coach who's worked with Masters athletes at that level. Because the reality is, if you're just working with, your run of the mill coach who has never done that, they're not entirely sure what that process would look like to get you to that point. Second, prioritize movement, recovery, and mobility above like progress in your lifts and things like that for the first, I don't know, I'm not going to put a time on it, but until you have all the requisite movement capacities to be able to be competitive in the sport, then start building your gymnastic skills, your strength skills, and things like that. That's your path forward. Prioritize those things. For the person who, has been a competitor for a long time, as a 10-year training history, I would say, number one, you got to prioritize your recovery habits and be disciplined with those things. And I think recovery habits also include your warm up, because that's one of the things that's going to make it so that your training affects you negatively less, right? So make sure you're taking care of that. Look for things outside of the gym that you can do to support your training and stack those habits. So like if you have a breath holds, for example, one of the things that both you and I are invested in, stack your breath holds with your shower or something like that. Like just integrate those habits into your life so that you're getting as much out of the time that you do have as possible. Then I would also say hire a coach who's guided people there, but it's probably less important to have like a one-on-one coach at that point. You might even be able to follow like a Masters blog or something like that. As long as you have all the requisite skills, you have the efficiency, you've prioritized to movement economy, and you're taking care of those recovery habits and you're disciplined with those things, then you should be able to continue to progress towards that level.
Yeah. On that note, about coaching, like you might not need a one-on-one coach. I've been thinking about this a lot. I had a conversation with Chandler via text yesterday, and he was like, we were talking about athletes, and he said, "Is Mike your coach?" And I said, "Well, no, I have many coaches." And I wasn't saying it tongue in cheek, but I felt like it could have been like one of those Mr. Miyagi quotes that came out. And he's
Eastern
like, hey, and he said, "Explain." And I was like, well, Mia organizes my training week and writes half of my sessions, which are all my CrossFit priorities that I don't want to do. I write all my strength work. I do gymnastics bodies progressions, which are from a gymnastics coach. I do BFR calf protocols that I got from you. Ryan wrote me a calf protocol that I do to work on the asymmetry of my ankles. Adam wrote me a calf and bounding protocol to improve my ability to rebound and jump on a regular basis.
What's the name of that program?
Springy Maxwell.
We should package and sell that.
And, Mike and Brandon have helped me with like my ability to, all right, now you're going into a Metcon. So I was like, I'm coached by the culture more than I'm like coached. But I think Masters athletes or anybody that's been in the game for a really long time, the illusion that anybody is is coached by themselves is silly, right? Like Rich Froning, yeah, he coached himself, but he also did consults with a lot of different types of people. He took weightlifting programs that were online. He got a master's degree in school, so he learned from professors and all. Like, there's so many other people that help prop that up. The phrase "it takes a village," I think, is true in some capacity. So I think everyone should be seeking guidance and coaching in some capacity. And as a master's athlete, if you're getting into it late, it might just look like, hey, find somebody outside of your circle that you pay a consult once a month to talk about what your training is and what you're doing and what the direction is, just to make sure that you're outside of your own, your own thought processes a little bit.
Well, I think that's a good point, is when I say you don't necessarily need to have an individual coach, but that you could follow a program.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is that you can follow a program with a community, with support. But to be clear, like, I would like to go to the Masters CrossFit Games and I would like to finish as high as possible. So guess what I did? I hired a coach.
Yeah, for sure.
So what I really want to tell people is if you're in if you're a male in 35 to 39 division, just go follow some blog program.
Yeah, perfect.
If you're anybody else in any other division, hire a coach.
All right. So
And always make sure you put a spare Depends in your training bag.
yeah, just in case you got a loose butt and you leak a little
Like
bit.
I was going to lose it yesterday. A burpee repeat.
Yeah, my only feedback or my only thought to get around this is that you should be more thoughtful as a master's athlete. Sit down, do goal setting. You need better time management skills because you got more priorities. You got to do a sport analysis to figure out what you need to work on. And I don't think just the, hey, I'm going to jump in and work hard and trust the process is going to work as successfully as you get older and older and older. You just need to be a little bit more mindful. And I think if you do that, the journey of being a master's athlete can potentially be more rewarding, but definitely more enjoyable. And the reward is a little bit different. It's not like money and glory, but it's connection, community, camaraderie, personal growth, personal development, observation of your age peer group and what's happening to their bodies. People that used to be super athletic that you see over the course of a decade and you're in your mid 30s and you're like, what happened to you? Like, you had so many physical gifts that you just let go away. And then being able to look in the mirror and know that you didn't let that happen, that you worked hard for something that you could be proud of. So I think there's a lot of stuff that could come from master's development, and a lot of that would come through a cerebral process. So make sure you think about what you're doing as you're decaying into your grave.
Is that how you felt, Kyle? Like you went to the airport and you're like, I've won this shit. You can't even untie your shoes to put it in the fucking TSA box.
No, that's definitely not how I felt at the end of that. I was like, I'm sore as fuck. Right now.
You can't tie your shoes. Yeah.
Sure. I will tell you that winning that took so much fucking willpower by the end of that to like keep my shit together through the last day. 4 days is a long time
that was
for
a long
older
event.
athletes.
Yeah.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thanks for staying around. And it's probably your nap time anyway. So we'll let you go.
Peace out. Have a good nap.